Jai Jawan, the untold story of a legendary band of men who laid the foundation for the Indian Air Force. Around 88 years ago, an important event took place in the history of the Indian subcontinent that subtly yet irrevocably altered the dynamics of the relationship between British Raj and its subjects in colonial India. The event was the birth of the Indian Air Force on October 8, 1932. Although unheralded by any fanfare, the Gazette notification that carried the announcement was a moment of great import. It embodied the hopes and aspirations of a subjugated nation that wished to prove that its youth were the equals, if not the betters, of their colonial rulers. In 1930, 6 young men, Harish Chandra Sircar, Subroto Mukherjee, Amarjit Singh, Bhupendra Singh, Aizad Baksh Awan and T.N. Tandon were sent to England to train as pilots at Royal Air Force Cranwell, while 29 were recruited from railway workshops in India to train as hawai sepoys or apprentice aircraft hands. This is the little known story of the legendary band of Indian Air Force men who were the earliest pioneers of military aviation in India. The first squadron of the Indian Air Force, No.1 Squadron, was formed in 1932, equipped with just one Westland Wapiti. The British called this aircraft Wapiti aircraft. However, it was only in 1937 that the Indian pilots, who had by then familiarized themselves with flying rules and regulations, were sent on their first field operation in the Northwest Frontier Province, where they proved their worth. On September 3, 1939, in a landmark event, the Indian Air Force No.1 Squadron got its first Indian commanding officer, Subroto Mukherjee, and all British officers were withdrawn, making it an all-Indian squadron for the first time. It was in early 1942, during the Burma campaign, that the Indian Air Force truly came of age. The Second World War had broken out, and the British, who were outwitted by the Japanese on the Eastern War front, were left with no alternative but to draft the No.1 Squadron of the Indian Air Force into Burma, now Myanmar, to counter the invading Japanese forces. The Indian Air Force performed brilliantly, with the Indian pilots winning 22 Distinguished Flying Crosses and 1 Distinguished Service Order. In recognition of the services rendered by the Indian Air Force, the King of England prefixed Royal to the service. Thus, the Indian Air Force was known as Royal Indian Air Force until January 26, 1950, when India became a republic and the Royal Indian Air Force was reconverted to Indian Air Force. One of the most remarkable stories of this historic campaign is of Indian Air Force engineer Harish Chandra Singh, whose wizardry at repairing and modifying planes was the stuff of legends. After having graduated as an engineer from the elite McLangan Engineering College in Lahore, Harish Chandra had signed on as a lowly hawai sepoy with the Indian Air Force. During the Burma campaign in World War II, Harish Chandra was a warrant officer in the Indian Air Force. A little later, on February 1, 1942, Harish Chandra and Jumbo were with their squadron at the Royal Air Force Base in Taungoo, Burma. The next day, the base was hit by a Japanese bombing raid. At that point of time, the British campaign was not going well, and the talk about withdrawing from Burma had further brought down the morale of the pilots. While the Royal Air Force was putting up a dispirited fight, Indian Air Force daredevil and unorthodox commanding officer Jumbo had a most audacious idea that he shared with his engineer. He wanted to bomb the Japanese airbase with obsolete reconnaissance aircraft. Harjinder took up the challenge. 7 decades before India started talking about making India, the first engineer officer of Indian Air Force converted a whole squadron of 12 slow-moving Lysander planes into deadly bombers. The missions were flown unescorted by Indian pilots who carried out daring dive bombings and pinpoint attacks. Jumbo personally led a series of successful offensive strikes against numerous Japanese airfields. The Indian Air Force Squadron also supported the Chinese Army operations in the campaign. The squadron performed so well that in appreciation they were presented a gold wing by the Chinese, a rare honor indeed. Jumbo's plan worked. The heroic exploits of the Indian pilots at Kohima and Impal were counted in aviation history as among the most effective counter-attacking aerial campaigns under siege conditions, while Jumbo became the first Indian pilot to be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross in World War II for his exploits in Burma. Harjinder was awarded and member of the Order of the British Empire for his incredible effort and ingenuity. Harjinder Singh went on to have many firsts to his name. He was the first Indian NCO, warrant officer, corporal, flight sergeant. More than 5 decades ago, he rolled out the first Indian-made aircraft, the Avro 748, from the aircraft manufacturing depot at Kanpur in 1961. He continued to run a program to design and build indigenous aircraft way till he retired as an Air Vice Marshal in 1964. The Indian government abandoned the program after he retired. Also, the very talented aircraft engineer never forgot his dream of flying. Having spotted the wreck of a Spitfire in Kanpur, he completely restored and rebuilt the plane with some help from Rolls-Royce and started flying it to all his meetings. In the 1950s, Harjinder finally underwent military pilot training from the Indian Air Force and successfully got his wings, that too in his own Spitfire. Post-independence, Harjinder and his fellow Indian Air Force pioneers gave up a life of ease and comfort to lay the foundations of India's Air Force. Having given independent India an entire bomber fleet by cannibalizing and restoring destroyed British and American planes. These men could well have be the poster boys of the government's Make in India program. Jai Hind.